Okay, we're going to talk finally about the sequencer. There's a lot of information to share, so I'm going to dive right into it. I'm going to hit all of the relatively boring stuff right at the start. I'm sorry for that, so you're not going to hear like funky sequencer goodness until later. Click the sequencer button. Now the sequencer is ready to go. Over here, we have a whole slew of functionality that you need to address before you make your sequence. First of all, place source. How is the sequence going to be triggered? We have the ability to trigger it from the sequencer, from a key. That means you can press a note and the sequencer will start. That'd be great for the situations where the sequencer is being used as an extensive modulation tool, more so than a note playing tool, but also you could use it for a note playing tool when you have the setting. Also, external in. When it gets an external signal through the audio in, it could start then. And then you have all 4 CV inputs could trigger it to start. You'll notice when it's in sequencer, the next functionality, play mode, is off. That means because when you press play, it's just going to go through all of the different steps. But if you set it to, say, key, step becomes possibility, which means you can play each step of the sequence with the keys. Or you can trigger each step from an external in or from your modular synthesizer or rhythm device through the CV ins. So you have multiple play modes. Also the opportunity to just play the sequence once when it is triggered. Restart. Restart means when the sequence is played, where does it start? If restart is on, it starts from the start. If restart is off, that means it starts from the place where you stopped. So for my purposes, I'm just going to have it on because I'm going to be pressing that play button a lot. Okay, over here on the envelope trigger step, that means when that's on, that each step will trigger the amplifier envelope for each step. When that's off, the amplifier envelope is only triggered at the beginning. With that off, that's not the case. So there's a lot of reasons for you to do both. I'm going to leave it on for now. Down along the bottom here, we can see that there are some tabs. So if we click on sequencer, arpeggiator, we have some very important information that can also be controlled by these 2 knobs right here, the beats per minute and the clock divide. This is important because it tells us how quickly these individual steps are going to go by and what they represent. The BPM, how many beats per minute. And the beats are defined by the clock divide. For example, it's set to 16th notes right now. So that's 16 of these beats. 16 beats per measure in music notation. So this is exactly one measure. Each of these represents a 16th note. And there are 4 beats, and those 4 beats are going to define the BPM. So at 102, we're going to have 1 beat per 4 steps in the sequencer. And that's the kind of math that's going to happen. I'm terrible at math, so I can't believe I even got through that like I did. But for example, so if we set it to quarter note, now all of these represent a quarter note. We have more measures, less rhythmic complexity. So that's basically how it works. There's a lot of math that goes on and I'm afraid of. Okay, so then we already saw the sequencer section. Arpeggiator we're not going to talk about because we're not talking about the arpeggiator right now. And the sequencer miscellaneous thing here only has one section and it's called length. And what you're deciding here is super cool. You have 16 by 16 or 32 by 8. And there's some sort of economy happening here, but I'll explain it to you. Okay, 16, that tells us that the sequence is going to be 16 notes long. If we have it set to 32, that means the sequence is going to be 32 notes long, and we access the second 16 beats, 16 steps, by pressing this button. So when we have it set to this particular setting, we have the opportunity to have either a length of 32 or a length of 16. So the second number, what's the second number? The second number unlocks a door to modulation happiness. Your first track, there are multiple tracks in this sequencer. What we're looking at right here isn't just one track like in a vintage step sequencer that you'd find on a vintage modular. We certainly have what they have here, but there are 15 more levels of modulation possibility and value sequencing. So this bottom level is notes. It's hardwired to notes. It's always going to be notes. But each of the 15 other levels can be used to control any other functionality that can be controlled on the synthesizer. And they don't have to go by the same rhythms or patterns. It is, of course, subject to the same BPM and clock divide, but you can create a variety of different values going to a variety of different sections. So that's 16 levels of modulation possibility and note changes, and we'll cover all that. But this thing is highly complex and capable of a huge amount of modulation. When we have it set to 32, that means we get twice as long. That means the sequence is then 32 steps, which we can subdivide in any way we want with clock divide. But then we only have 8 levels of modulation. But let me tell you, 8 levels of modulation is a lot of different sequences directing other things to do other things at the same BPM and clock divide as our bottom level note sequence. So that's the functionality you kind of need to be aware of before you start. But once we have made those decisions, I'm going to put it to 16 and 16 because 32, it's easier to demonstrate with 16. Once you have those settings set to what you want, you are pretty much ready to dive in. We're going to make the clock divide 1/8 notes. That's my choice. Okay, so that is our sequencer parameters that we have to set before we dive into sequencing. So next we're going to talk about how the heck do you record with this sequencer. Let's say we want to record some notes. How are we going to do this? Well, I'm glad you asked because it's simple. Okay, we're just going to press record and now I'm going to play some notes. Okay, we're done. You'll notice all the lights came on. They're all full of notes now. Since we're doing a 16 step sequence, we're full. I've filled it up. I've been greedy. I'm sorry. Okay, so here's what we got. And here's your evidence that I told you the truth. I set the subdivision on the clock divide to 1/8 notes. The tap tempo is showing us the tempo right now. And we can also see that it's consistent with the lights. But these are our quarter notes. And so the 1/8 notes are twice as fast. Okay, so that's the subdivision we've chosen. And we've got our sequence and we're happy. Now I will tell you that you could have easily just pressed each button and then, as you can probably see here, I hope you can see, we can see what note and what octave each of these notes are. I played C4, D4, 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 A4, etc. Your soft knob up here, note, allows you to select a particular step, and then you could change that note to anything you want, anywhere from C0 up to C10. It's a little bit high for our purposes. It's not quite as cool now. But if that's what you want, you could do that. I can't remember what actually was that a C4? We're going to say it's a C4. Yes. Okay. So we can adjust the note. We can also adjust the velocity. Now, I don't know how you play your Pro 2, but I usually play my Pro 2 so that it is set to just straight envelope amount. We have to go down into the amplifier envelope, and I usually have my amplifier envelope controlling the amp. But we also have the ability to use the velocity amount to control the amp as well through the envelope. And that allows the keyboard, which is velocity sensitive, to make decisions about the intensity of the notes that we're playing. We need to have it set to this when we're using the sequencer. If we plan to use the velocity setting. So velocity, my playing actually set the velocity for each of these notes, but if you want to modify them, you can. So let's go to step 8 and we'll bring that velocity down. There, now let's listen. So did you hear how 8 was quieter? Yeah, right there. So you have the ability to set the velocity for any of these notes at any point you like. We also have the ability to set slew. Before we talk about that, as you'll see, I keep making selections. I'm making step selections. There are two things that can happen when you press these buttons. If you tap the button, you'll mute it. And you can see it muted over here. We see the asterisks. Now it won't play. So you have the ability to decide which notes are actually playing at any given moment as your sequence is playing, which is fun. But you may have noticed that I was pressing the buttons and that was not happening. I was actually just selecting each step. That happens by just holding the button a little bit longer. There. It doesn't mute it. I've selected it. I can make my change. Now, slew basically rounds off the voltages so that they vary over time. Basically, they're not immediately. And so on this level, it's going to cause sort of a portamento effect. So you can hear that note kind of, it is connecting, it is diminishing the voltage. It really is a sort of portamento. That's what slew essentially is. So you hear both of those notes are actually altered because the change between the notes is slowed and it creates that particular effect. Lastly, we have tie, which is connecting some of these notes so that they are held for a longer time. For example, let's choose 3. And just by going to the tie knob, we can turn it and it will connect 2 notes, and the note will be held throughout those 2 notes. Let's see, where else do we have repeated notes? And you could do it for any number of the notes you'd like. And the cool thing is, I don't know if you can see this in the video, but the tied notes, the notes that are tied to a note, are dim. So as it's playing, if you're not on this window, you can see which notes are tied. And there's another way to do this, and I think it's just holding the buttons. Let's see. Let's turn this tie off and see if this works. Let's see, we hold this, and then there. We can also create the tie that way. If we're right in the midst of our incredible set and we want to create a tie right there without going to the window, you can just hold the first note and then press to the next step that you want it to go to. And that is pretty much all there is to recording notes to our bottom bass level sequence. The rest of the levels will allow us to do some crazy modulations to a variety of the functionality of the synthesizer that will make our sequence more interesting. And we'll cover that next.